Hello, and welcome back to the Author Roundup, a special segment of the Book Connection Show where we meet up and coming indie authors and talk to them about their recently released books. Welcome back to the Author Roundup. This is Ray Walters. On today's show, we have someone whose work has truly been a guiding light for many, offering understanding and support through life's most difficult transitions. With over 30 years of experience, she has served as a licensed psychotherapist, life and executive coach, adjunct professor, and business consultant. Her approach, inspired by the transformative work of Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, brings a unique blend of empathy and insights to the challenges of change and loss, always with an eye toward growth. Her book, Uplifting, Inspiring Stories of Loss, Change, and Growth, captures her philosophy beautifully, sharing powerful stories that offer hope and resilience. It's my pleasure to introduce, on today's show, Dr. Katie Eastman. Hi, Dr. Katie. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here.
All right, Dr. Katie, I'm going to jump right in. Your book, Uplifting, talks about change and loss, and these are constants in our lives. Now, could you share what inspired you to write this book and to bring your own stories and those of others into the spotlight?
When I was a bit younger, I had a vision of creating a children's hospice program after reading Elisabeth Kübler-Ross's book on death and dying. And I accomplished that in my later years. And it was the children of the hospice that inspired me to write the book, because I watched how their short lives impacted so many people and inspired so many people, so that I absolutely had to write their stories. And then after COVID, I decided, it's not just them, but I've learned so much from so many people and their resilience during unimaginable loss. I had to tell their stories, and I did.
That's very insightful, Dr. Katie. Now, Dr. Katie, let's talk about your experience as a psychotherapist and a life coach, and it spans over 3 decades. Now, how have these roles influenced the perspective and stories shared in your book, Uplifting, and how have your own views on change and loss evolved over the years?
Well, like everyone, as I aged throughout my life, I had more losses and more reference to my own personal losses. So, one of the things I talk about in the book is my loss of infertility, the losses that I experienced of losing children, losing births. And so that informed me a lot about how to be with other people and their losses. So as I grew and understood how to cope with my own losses, that helped me be more present, more empathic, and more understanding of what someone goes through when they experience a change that's unexpected, that is a loss so deep, and it affects all aspects of their life. I was experiencing that at the same time that I was working with other people who were also experiencing that. So they inform me and I inform myself.
Right. I do agree. At some point in our lives, we go through losses and changes. Dr. Katie, throughout Uplifting, you emphasize that loss doesn't just have to be something we endure. It can be transformative. How did you come to view loss as a superpower? Okay, and how has this perspective shaped your work with others?
Well, it became my superpower as I was both enduring my own losses, but also trying to make sense of how my loss could help others.
Mm.
So I was very blessed very early on in my career to be taught that loss could be an opportunity. The superpower comes from your powerful experience of clarifying what is most important in your life when you go through a loss. And once you identify those values, then you can commit to making changes in your life that improve your life, increase your wisdom, and make you a better you. And I went through that in my own experience, which I talk about in the book, but also I witnessed it in so many other lives. So it is an opportunity to transform.
Right. Dr. Eastman, just a follow-up question to that. You witnessing losses and helping people go through transitions, does it become easier over time, or it's still the same amount of feeling that we invest whenever we process loss, and as you walk with the people you've helped with, as you walk them through the process?
When it becomes easier, I'll quit. No, I still feel just as much as I did when I was 21. What I do with those feelings is very different now. I allow myself to feel the feelings that I have after sitting with someone with a serious loss. And then I move on. That's what's changed. The impact of their loss and sitting with their pain has not changed, but how I cope with it and what I do with it has, because I now have tools that allow me to experience their loss and stay present with their pain, and then take care of myself afterwards and move on with my life so that I can be ready for the next person or my family or my friends or life.
Well, still on the topic of loss, Dr. Katie, in your book, you described it as a catalyst for growth and inner harmony. Now, in what ways can grief and hardship help us understand ourselves better, even if it does? You've said it a while back. It doesn't change. It overwhelms people. Whenever we go through it, it overwhelms us. So again, in what ways can grief and hardship help us understand ourselves better, even when that loss is overwhelming?
One of the stories in the book is Jason. He was 17, diagnosed with cancer, and he knew he was going to die. And one of the things he said to me, which will always be a guiding light in my life, is that if I'm going to have this thing and I'm going to experience these losses and these struggles, I'm going to make it count. I'm going to help other people. I'm going to inspire other people. My life is going to matter, even if it's only a shortened life. I'm going to make a difference while I'm here. So that is what I mean by uplifting. When we have our pain and we make a conscious choice to learn from what we're going through, how to be a better person, what our skills, gifts, and talents are, what we value, who we want to support, and how we can support someone, then it becomes meaningful. And when it becomes meaningful, it transforms our lives into a purposeful life. And a purposeful life is a life that lifts us up, but also others.
I agree. Dr. Katie, one beautiful aspect of your book is, well, you've talked about this a little earlier, but I just want to go ahead and dive a little deep into this, because your book actually talked about how it encourages readers to find strength and new beginnings in the wake of loss. What would you say is the first step someone can take to start transforming their own experience of loss?
One of the things I did with writing this book is create what I call my recreate process of loss, change, and growth. And I have little cards that are the same as the questions at the end of each chapter in the book that prompt us to think and go deeper. So the first thing to do is to reflect. The first is, which is to sit back, relax, reflect on your previous losses, how you've coped, what you've learned, and what is one thing in your life that if you could change it and make your life better, what would it be? Use your pain and your power and bring them together and commit to doing that one thing. And that will help you make a conscious choice of how you want to manage and cope with your loss. Because I don't want people to just let the loss manage them or the
Mhm.
change. I want them to
Mhm.
manage their loss and their change. And
Mhm.
that's what Jason's whole philosophy was. He was the first luminary that I talk about in the book. And because he made a conscious choice, I'm going to die, but I'm going to do something before I do. And every one of us, if a 17-year-old can make a commitment like that, every one of us can. When we go through a hard time, if I'm going to go through a struggle and I know it's coming, or even if
Mhm.
I don't, I can choose how I go through it.
That's very inspiring, Dr. Katie. How can your readers apply the lessons in uplifting, especially the ones that you've just talked about, not just in times of personal loss, but also in navigating changes in their professional lives or relationships?
Right. One of the things that I do as a consultant and as an executive coach is I work with companies and organizations when they're going through transitions, like downsizing,
Mhm. Mhm.
where people are being laid off. When someone receives a notice that they're going to be laid off, their first reaction is grief. Of course, it's grief, it's shock. It's like Kübler-Ross described to us. Our first response is disbelief.
Right.
Well, with that disbelief, take time as the process of the emotional response to this change gives you information, and ask yourself, where's the opportunity? Where's the silver lining? Maybe I don't see it right now, but if I sit back and allow myself to ask questions about where I might want to be in this company, or maybe I don't anymore. Maybe my skills, gifts, and talents belong somewhere else. Where is the opportunity from change? And the loss and the grief and the emotions, they are our messengers because they tell us what matters to us and what's most
Mm.
important. So when you go through, say, a downsizing or any kind of change in your workplace or your personal life, if you're divorcing, if the questions you ask yourself are related to where's my opportunity to live a
Yeah.
different, better life, you will have a meaningful transformation.
It's very insightful, Dr. Katie. And I do agree. Whenever we're in a situation that's overwhelming, in moments where we feel that we're stressed, there's always this natural feeling, especially I'm speaking for myself, especially when I wanted to just really get out of it as quick as I can because of the discomfort, obviously. By doing so, I'm becoming more stressed, and I'm no longer using the situation that I'm in to learn, to grow, and to appreciate life, that is. And that's just really hard to do. I would admit. I mean, it's easier said than done. When you're looking from the outside in, it's quite easy, but when you're the one processing everything, the pain of the loss, it's just, I think it's but natural for us to just want to go ahead and say something like, I want to get out of this situation as quick as I can.
Exactly. And one of the things, that's not a bad thing. But what we need to remember about that is that yes, we don't need to grieve all the time. We don't have to stay in our emotions the whole time, but keep revisiting them. Grief revisits us and gives us opportunity over and over and over if we listen. Grief is not linear. We don't get over the loss of something that matters to us
Yes.
ever. It revisits us from time to time and gives us another opportunity to say, wow, I am so grateful that I had that relationship, but wow, it hurts that they're not here.
Mm,
And one of the things that I want to say too is I learned from the people in this book, the inspiring stories, presence.
mm,
I learned to communicate without words. So many of these people, like these children that I call luminaries, were not
mm,
able to speak, but we spoke with our eyes, we spoke with our energy, we communicated in way beyond traditional communication. And I learned so much about how important it is for us to be still, silent, quiet, and reflect. Not all the time, but if we deny our time to do that and deny our emotions and deny grief, we deny our opportunity to learn.
It's very inspiring. Let's talk about your experience in writing, not loss this time, but your experience in writing your book. Now, for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, and for your curiosity also, what part of the book did you enjoy writing the most? Which part of the process did you find most challenging? And how long did it take you to finish?
Okay. Well, first, it took me 10 years, 10 years. And the reason being, when you write a book, it has its own organic process.
Mm,
And especially if you're writing about someone else's life. So what happened to me, the most challenging part about writing the book, and as well the most rewarding, was the stories of the dying children, because I went to publisher after publisher who said, nobody's going to publish this book. Nobody wants to read a book about dying children. And so I was very discouraged when I first started writing it.
mhm.
And it was Louise Hay from Hay House Publishing who said to me when I went to her and went to one of her workshops, and I was just distraught. And I said, Louise, I really want to tell these stories, but people are telling me I can't. And she said, oh, Katie, and I will never forget what she said. She looked me right in the eye and she said, go ask the children. So I did. I sat in a room and I imagined that all the children I wrote about were in the room. And I asked them to tell me what each of their lessons would have been, what they would have told people. Could they have spoken? What would they have said that they wanted everyone to remember them for? And I got those words like that. They came to me immediately. And so I never felt alone in writing this book. I felt like the stories wrote themselves with me. And,
Mm,
and I literally wrote this book different places. I wrote it sitting by the ocean, sitting in a field, sitting in my bedroom, at a desk in different states, all different places, because I would get inspiration and I'd say, okay, I've got to write. And at one point, I stopped writing and I let that be for a couple
mm,
years until I was ready to write again. And then it flowed out of me like crazy. After COVID, during COVID and after COVID, I wrote like a madwoman. I would
mm.
sit and write for 5 hours and not stop. And my family would go by and go, you're still writing. What are you doing? And I was like, I have to say this. I have to say this. So a book has its own organic process. And the hardest part was when people told me what mattered most to me, I couldn't do. That
Mm.
became the most rewarding part of the book. And also, interestingly enough, the part of the book people comment on the most.
Speaking of comments, but before we even jump into uh, that question, this is just a curious question that I have. You talked about luminaries, Jason being one of them.
Yes.
In your career, you've worked with so many people, and you said it's an organic process, but you when you're writing a book, but you have so many lives that you've come across with. And I think, or should I, I'm assuming, but let me ask you this question. Was it ever hard for you to choose which of these life stories are you going to put into the book? Or
Yes. Yes. I spent a lot of time making those selections. And I narrowed it down to life lessons and and people who would not otherwise tell their own story. And so I really narrowed down to those stories, like the children who died, who needed to have a voice, but they never would because they were no longer
Mhm.
here, and parents of children who had died, who their children were gone, but they had a voice, but they would never write their own story because it's too painful.
Right.
So that's what it came down to. I represented voices that I felt needed to be heard, but wouldn't tell their story.
See, thank you so much for that, Dr. Katie. Let's jump into comments and feedback because I got sidetracked because of that follow-up question. So your book came out March 20, am I
Yes.
correct? March 2020, 24, just this year. So what's the most meaningful feedback or review you've received so far about it?
I had my neighbor come up to me within days of the book coming out, and she said she couldn't put it down. And she said, Katie, I am not a self help person. I never read this kind of book, but
Mhm,
your
mhm,
book was different for me. And she called me and she said, Katie, I have so many questions for you. And she went with her husband and she walked through our local park for hours talking about the questions at the end of each chapter and relating them to her life. And
mhm.
she was so intrigued by self reflection that she had never done, that she absolutely loved my book. And she said, your book is the first self help book I've ever read that I really, really loved. And that was so meaningful to me because we never know when we write a book who it's going to touch. And I've had so many people. Someone reached out to me last week who said their mother died and they had the book, but they weren't ready to read it yet. And then when they did, it met every need they had. I have people in other parts of the world reading it who are being touched by the inspiration of the children's stories. So many, but that one really stuck out to me because I opened a door for someone to look at their life differently. And that's why I wrote the book.
That's very inspirational, Dr. Katie. What advice this time will you give to a writer who is working on their first book?
So many things. But the number one is the book will write itself if you get out of the way. A book has its own organic process. And I had my amazing editor who was extremely patient with me, Christopher Murray, and he
Mhm,
stayed with me for a few years while I went through the process of, well, I want this, but I don't want that. And he was
mhm,
patient with me and allowed me the time it took. So, two things: allow it to go its own organic process and also get help when you need it. I took writing courses, I had an editor, and for 3 years, I prepared myself to even begin writing.
That's awesome. This time, let's talk about your goals. What personal and professional goals do you have for your writing as this year is about to end and as the next year is about to begin also?
My next year, I am working on a book project and a big movement actually about peace. One of the stories in my book is about a little girl in Ukraine who lost hope because she woke up one morning and her whole country was being bombed. And so she asked me the question, where can I find hope? And so I realized in that moment that a lot of people don't really understand the process of discovering inner peace. And
Mm,
so I walked with this little girl through that process for over a year. And she now is doing gymnastics and she has friends. Whereas when I first started working with her, she couldn't even get out of bed. And the reason being, she had a vision and
mhm,
she had some reason to get up and get out of bed. She started walking a dog that gave her the courage and the strength and the reason to get out of bed and get outside. And then she met children, and then she started creating friendships, and then she went back to school. And so that is what I want to do in my next year, is help people talk about peace, discover inner peace, extend peace to others. So my next book is about that, and I'm writing it with a friend. And we are creating a movement where we want to percolate peace. We want to bring people
mm.
together talking about peace. We have 1 million people we want to bring together.
It's very inspiring. Finally, if there's one message that you'd like readers to take away from uplifting, what would it be? And of course, for anyone interested, where can they grab a copy of your book?
There is a very special quote in the very beginning of my book, and it is a interaction between Austin, who was 8 years old, and his mother. And Austin said to his mom 3 days before he died, "Mom, I have a message for you, and I want you to share it with the whole world."
Yes.
And he said, "There's love inside all of us and around all of us. There's angels everywhere. And Mom, the purpose of life is to make a difference." And when she said to him, "Austin, how do you know that? And I don't?" He said, "Mom, you did, but you grew up."
Mm.
So, my message to everyone and my reason for writing this book is those children and all the people suffering all kinds of losses, we're all making a difference in someone else's life. And interestingly enough, Austin's quote was repeated by Oprah 20 years later to Jason on a phone call, that the purpose of life is to make a difference. So, two very wise individuals, one 8 years old and one, I don't know how old she was at that point, but repeated the same words. So, I think there's magic in those words.
Dr. Katie, it was a pleasure having you on the show today. Thank you so much for discussing your book with us.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I have really enjoyed it. And Uplifting is available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble and any place where you would find a book in both hardcover, softcover, also on electronic.
Well, Dr. Katie, thank you so much again for gracing the show and for saying yes to our invitation. I just want to go ahead and give a big shout out to all our awesome viewers and listeners for joining us for this interview. Stay tuned for more inspiring conversations on the Book Connection Show. I'm Ray Walters, and I look forward to diving into self-supported publishing with you next time, one indie author at a time.